New evidence is pushing a single hypothesis to the front that the disappearance may not be a wandering incident at all, but an event involving Chris Proudfoot himself. Unexplained marks on his arm, a scent trail that stops exactly where a light moves through the ditch, and a custody timeline tightening around him all appear in the same window of time. Add sudden relocation, non-functional cameras, and shifting statements, and the pattern becomes difficult to ignore. If every anomaly aligns with one hypothesis, why has it not become the official direction of inquiry? The first inflection point in the Sebastian Rogers case does not appear in a statement, a search log, or a police report. It appears in the alignment of 3 early forensic signals, each one significant on its own, but far more consequential when evaluated together. These signals form the baseline from which any serious analytical review must begin. Unexplained injuries visible on Chris Proudfoot's arm during the initial interview, 3 leaked security camera clips showing an unidentified vehicle, and rapid light movement at approximately 3 a.m., and the Proudfoot's abrupt departure from the area immediately after the disappearance. When considered in sequence, these signals dismantle the wandering ASD teen narrative and instead establish a measurable probability vector, pointing toward the individual with the strongest proximity, motive pressure, and behavioral inconsistencies, Chris Proudfoot. The first signal is visible, permanent, and recorded on video. A set of marks on Chris Proudfoot's arm captured during the earliest on-camera interview. These marks, circular, uneven, and clustered, resemble bite or scratch patterns rather than incidental surface abrasions. Their positioning and shape do not align with animal scratches, despite claims that a dog caused them. With contrast filters applied, the injuries show distinct spacing consistent with human dentition or forceful defensive contact. What elevates the relevance is not only the presence of the injuries, but the complete absence of a coherent explanation in any interview. Proudfoot neither conceals the marks nor provides a timeline for when they occurred, creating an immediate forensic ambiguity. In a missing child case, particularly one involving a caregiver, unexplained injuries on an adult within the disappearance window represent a critical red flag indicator. Investigative frameworks categorize these as non-accidental injury vectors, often appearing in scenarios involving physical struggle, overcorrection, or escalation. That Proudfoot appeared on camera displaying these marks without acknowledgement or clarification suggests either overconfidence, miscalculation, or a belief that the marks would not draw scrutiny. None of these interpretations align well with innocent caregiver behavior under acute stress. The marks establish the first leg of what becomes the Proudfoot vector: proximity plus opportunity and unexplained physical evidence. The second forensic signal comes from 3 leaked security camera videos sourced from a garage camera at 101 Stafford. Although these clips contain no explicit view of Sebastian or the Proudfoots, they document anomalies in the environment precisely within the estimated disappearance window. Their relevance lies not in what they conclusively show, but in what they contradict and what they suggest. The first clip captures a stationary vehicle parked in the roadway. Its lights activate abruptly, tail lights, or headlights depending on angle, without evidence of forward movement. This contradicts the explanation later repeated by both Chris and Seth that the lights belong to trash trucks. A statement derived from law enforcement, but unsupported by the observable characteristics in the footage. Trash trucks do not idle silently at 3 a.m. without visible structure, sound, or movement. The posture of the vehicle suggests waiting behavior, not municipal service. The second clip, the 19-second full-frame flashlight segment, shows a single moving light in the drainage ditch separating the Rogers home from adjacent properties. The ditch is significant because it lies along the exact vector where K9 units lost scent continuity. Movement inside the ditch at 3 a.m. carries high evidentiary weight because it maps directly onto the only known environmental anomaly matching K9 trajectory failure. The third clip shows a rapid light movement returning toward the property. The speed and trajectory of this motion do not match the expected movement of an ASD teenager walking barefoot in darkness. Instead, the motion is linear, quick, and deliberate, suggesting an adult moving with purpose rather than a child wandering. The combined camera footage contradicts the sleepwalking or silent exit narrative. No ordinary residential environment at 3 a.m. contains a stationary unknown vehicle, a rapid light source moving through a ditch, a returning light source matching adult cadence. Instead, the footage forms an environmental anomaly pattern, consistent with human-directed activity rather than accidental disappearance. This is the second leg of the Proudfoot vector: environmental inconsistency plus unexplained presence and alignment with scent cut off. The third forensic signal emerges not from physical evidence, but from post-incident behavior, an area of analysis frequently used in evaluating caregiver involvement. Within days of Sebastian's disappearance, Chris and Katie Proudfoot left the home and traveled in an RV, disconnecting entirely from Seth Rogers, the biological father, who continued daily searches. This action is inconsistent with any recognized innocent parent search profile. Parents of missing children overwhelmingly remain near the point of last contact, maintain proximity to investigators, and attempt to preserve the possibility of the child returning home. The Proudfoot's relocation, paired with their withdrawal from communication, forms an evasion indicator. Combined with earlier contradictions such as Proudfoot's claim of daily communication with Seth, directly contradicted by Seth's statement that he had not heard from them in 2 weeks, the departure suggests narrative instability. Behavioral forensics categorizes abrupt relocation during an active investigation as a scene abandonment anomaly, correlating strongly with individuals who perceive the home environment not as a potential return site, but as a risk area. This is the third leg of the Proudfoot vector: behavior incompatible with innocence, plus communication collapse and scene abandonment. Individually, each signal raises questions. Collectively, they reposition the entire case. A caregiver with unexplained injuries, a camera recording anomalous nighttime activity aligned with scent loss, and an immediate departure from the search area form a convergence pattern inconsistent with the accidental wandering hypothesis. Forensic analysis relies not on single anomalies, but on the intersection of multiple vectors. The Proudfoot vector, a synthesis of injury, vehicle, flashlight motion, and evasion, constitutes such an intersection. This convergence resets the investigative baseline from a low-probability concern regarding Sebastian's autism-related wandering to a high-probability concern regarding caregiver involvement, escalation, or post-incident concealment. Each signal intensifies the meaning of the others. The injuries become more relevant. When paired with camera anomalies, the anomalies gain context. When juxtaposed with behavioral evasion, the evasion gains weight when viewed alongside narrative inconsistencies. The purpose of establishing these three forensic signals at the start is not to draw premature conclusions, but to reframe the intellectual landscape. The original narrative, Sebastian silently walking out of the house barefoot in the dark, is incompatible with the cumulative evidence. Injury, anomaly, and evasion are not background details. They are foundational indicators of directionality. They mark the point where an accidental framework collapses and a suspect probability framework must begin. By laying out these signals first, the analysis rejects the assumption that Sebastian's autism alone explains the disappearance. Instead, it anchors the investigation in measurable anomalies tied directly to observable behavior, documented evidence, and unresolved contradictions. This early convergence establishes why the focus must shift away from speculative wandering models and toward the person whose actions, injuries, statements, and movements consistently align with the highest forensic relevance. Chris Proudfoot. The defining feature of the Proudfoot narrative is not what Chris and Katie say, but how often the content of their statements changes across interviews. When the disappearance of a minor is examined through a forensic lens, timeline stability becomes one of the most reliable markers of truthfulness. Genuine recollections remain structurally consistent even as emotions shift. Constructed accounts drift under scrutiny. In this case, the number of narrative shifts is not incidental, it forms a measurable pattern. Across their first interview, the Chronicles interview, the Nancy Grace segment, and Katie's subsequent retellings, at least 17 discrete timeline changes emerge. These contradictions collectively establish a story drift model. indicating an evolving effort to preserve control of the narrative rather than document actual memory. In the initial interview, Katie stated that after sending Sebastian to bed, she went to bed shortly after. This phrasing places the household into early quiet hours and suggests minimal time separation between the final interaction and the onset of sleep. In the later Chronicles interview, however, the time frame shifts dramatically. She claims she did not go to bed until about midnight. A discrepancy of several hours is not a benign lapse. It changes the entire disappearance window. It alters the period of parental proximity, the duration of unsupervised time, and the likelihood of intervening events. The magnitude of the shift indicates not memory decay, but structural narrative adjustment. In interview 1, Katie describes Sebastian as playing in his room when she instructed him to go to bed. In the Chronicles version, she claims that he took out the trash, a task requiring travel outdoors to the end of the driveway. These two activities occupy different physical spaces, involve different levels of awareness, and importantly, shift the perimeter of the child's last known location. A child playing indoors implies containment. A child walking to the driveway creates a scenario in which external access becomes plausible. The introduction of outdoor activity appears to retroactively justify the possibility of voluntary exit, a narrative expansion inconsistent with static memory recall. The reported duration of the initial search is critical in determining urgency, reaction, and decision-making. In the first interview, Katie claims she searched 3 minutes, give or take, before calling Chris. Later, she condenses the time frame to 1 minute flat. This reduction minimizes the perception of available time for broader house-wide verification and suggests an immediate sense of crisis. However, her earliest account, the version closest to the event, describes a more casual, measured process. Drastic compression of the timeline in later retellings signals an attempt to reframe her response as proportionate and appropriately urgent. It reflects temporal distortion characteristic of defensive reconstruction. Katie initially describes her reaction as not alarmed and frames her search as routine, implying she believed Sebastian might be showering or getting breakfast. In contrast, her Chronicles narrative presents immediate panic, hysteria, crying, and screaming. Emotional memory does not typically reverse polarity in such a dramatic fashion. Individuals may understate emotion in a public setting, but they do not fabricate an absence of alarm in one interview, only to retroactively assign overwhelming panic in another without an underlying motive. This shift appears aimed at correcting public criticism regarding her calm demeanor, further contributing to the story drift pattern. Chris and Katie claimed multiple floodlights, solar lights, garage lights, and perpetual illumination around the property. Independent documentation contradicts this. Only one porch light, 2 small solar lights, and 2 garage lights were present. Overstating exterior lighting artificially increases the plausibility of visually detecting a child leaving the residence. The inflation of lighting conditions suggests narrative manipulation to support claims of vigilance and household awareness. When a detail is static and verifiable, as exterior lighting is misrepresented, it indicates the presence of compensatory storytelling rather than factual recounting. The most significant behavioral contradiction concerns Katie's claim about driving to search for Sebastian. In the first interview, she describes searching the house and checking closets. No mention is made of leaving the property. In the Chronicles interview, however, she introduces a new sequence: running outside, shouting, entering her car, driving around the neighborhood, and traveling to Sebastian's school. This is a major narrative expansion. Leaving the property in a vehicle is a categorical behavioral escalation that cannot be accidentally omitted. Its absence in earlier accounts is consistent with post-event story enhancement rather than organic recall. Beyond the primary shifts, multiple smaller inconsistencies accumulate. The noise from room discrepancy, initially unmentioned, later presented as an audible event prompting verbal redirection. The frequency of communication with Seth, Chris claims, daily, while Seth reports no communication for 2 weeks. The description of Sebastian's behavior, from responsible and good to aggressive and growling. The clarity of the morning routine, inconsistent statements about checking the bed, checking the house, and rechecking locations. Each contradiction alone might be attributable to stress or imprecision. Collectively, they form a timeline-weighted instability. The later the interview, the greater the drift. This is a classical marker of narrative management. Forensic analysis views narrative drift not as deception proof, but as deception probability. When individuals with true memories recount an event multiple times, their stories preserve core chronology, even if emotional framing fluctuates. When details shift, structurally changing locations, durations, emotional states, actions, or direct cause and effect sequences, this suggests the speaker is maintaining a constructed narrative rather than retrieving an authentic one. The Proudfoot contradictions follow a predictable arc. Initial interviews contain minimal detail and lower emotional intensity. Subsequent interviews introduce justifications, expansions, and corrections. Later narratives reinterpret earlier moments to counter criticisms or fill logical gaps. This constitutes a textbook example of a story drift model formed under pressure. Why story drift indicates knowledge of event. In forensic linguistics and cognitive interviewing, knowledge of event refers to indicators that an individual possesses information they are actively concealing or modifying. Indicators include retroactive addition of justifying details, chronological compression or expansion, emotional inversion, and overcorrection in response to public perception. The Proudfoot's timeline shifts demonstrate all four. These contradictions do not prove involvement, but they materially increase the probability that the narrators are managing information rather than conveying memory. In missing child investigations, this pattern elevates the storyteller into the circle of investigative relevance. 17 timeline contradictions do not emerge spontaneously or coincidentally. They reflect a progressive reshaping of events, suggesting that the original version of the night is either incomplete, inaccurate, or incompatible with later public scrutiny. In the context of a missing minor, especially one with ASD, such instability is not a benign artifact, it is a directional signal. And in this case, the direction points back to the same individual identified by physical evidence, camera anomalies, and post-event behavior. Chris Proudfoot. The third analytical vector in this case is the set of unexplained injuries visible on the stepfather's arm during the earliest recorded interview. These marks were not mentioned, contextualized, or accounted for by the caregivers. Yet they appear clearly on camera and remain one of the few pieces of physical evidence originating from the household within the disappearance window. Their relevance does not stem from speculation, but from established forensic principles. When a caregiver presents with fresh, unaccounted for injuries at the time a child goes missing, those injuries become a primary point of inquiry. They form part of what investigators refer to as non-accidental injury indicators, an early physical red flag that suggests the possibility of a conflict, struggle, or escalation occurring before or during the critical timeline. In missing child cases, such injuries are rarely ignored because they are among the only concrete data points that cannot be altered by narrative adjustments. The marks documented on the arm are not random abrasions. With enhanced filters applied by analysts reviewing the interview footage, the patterns show rounded edges and spacing consistent with human bite arcs or defensive scratches. The curvature is uneven, forming partial semicircles that do not align with the linear or parallel rake marks typically associated with animal scratches. Dog scratches generally present as elongated streaks with directional flow. The marks on the arm instead display clusters of pressure points, varying indentation, and inconsistent depth attributes associated with human fingers pressing or scraping during a moment of resistance. Forensic comparison between these injuries and domestic animal patterns shows a clear mismatch. Even without high-resolution imagery, the spacing resembles the interphalangeal distance of a small hand more than any four-legged pet. This discrepancy becomes more significant given that the "dog did it" explanation appears only in community commentary, not in a verified statement from the caregiver. The absence of any formal explanation creates further ambiguity. Another point of concern is the complete lack of effort to conceal the injuries. In most innocence-based contextual interviews, caregivers under public scrutiny are acutely aware of optics. When presenting themselves to the media, Individuals who have nothing to hide generally attempt to look composed and uninjured. Conversely, individuals with concerning marks often conceal them, consciously or not, through clothing or posture. Here, the injuries are exposed in full view. This leads to a different interpretive issue, the possibility of overcompensation. Overcompensation occurs when a subject adopts an overly transparent posture to preempt suspicion, assuming that visible honesty will override forensic observation. Displaying unexplained injuries openly can be part of a confidence-based strategy in which the subject believes that the absence of concealment will be perceived as proof of innocence. It is not unusual in cases involving coercive personalities or individuals with a strong need to control public perception. This tendency is consistent with the behavioral patterns already observed in the interviews, where the stepfather frequently interrupts, directs, or corrects the flow of conversation in ways that indicate a desire to maintain authority over the narrative rather than submit to objective questioning. The injuries must also be placed within the timeline. They appear during the first public interview, meaning they were present immediately following the disappearance. Forensic relevance increases dramatically when injuries occur within the narrow temporal window in which the child was last confirmed to be safe. The absence of a time-stamped alternative source makes the injuries part of the critical event space. Investigators routinely ask when, how, and in what context a caregiver received injuries because unresolved marks indicate the possibility of a physical altercation. When a child with autism disappears under unclear circumstances, and the only adult present shows injuries consistent with defensive contact, the convergence creates a clear investigative priority. It does not determine guilt, but it demands reconciliation with the established timeline. No such reconciliation is provided. A further inconsistency arises from the caregiver's communications. Despite discussing multiple unrelated details freely, including CPS involvement, household routines, lighting conditions, and interpersonal dynamics, there is a conspicuous silence surrounding the marks. Subjects who inadvertently reveal incriminating evidence often respond with reflexive contextualization. They offer spontaneous explanations to minimize suspicion. The absence of any such explanation here is not neutral. Silence becomes a data point. It creates a vacuum that forces consideration of non-accidental origins. When an injury is benign, explanations tend to be immediate. When an injury is relevant to the event, explanations tend to be deferred or avoided. This avoidance, repeated across interviews, reinforces the possibility that the marks are tied to an escalation scenario within the household. Escalation conflict models help clarify why these injuries matter. In many caregiver-involved disappearances, the chain of events begins with an argument, confrontation, or disciplinary attempt that escalates beyond control. In such scenarios, the child may resist physically, resulting in scratches, bites, or defensive wounds on the adult. These wounds tend to appear on the arms, hands, or forearms, areas naturally exposed during physical engagement. The marks shown in the interview align closely with this anatomical distribution. They do not resemble the kind of injuries resulting from household accidents, nor the superficial abrasions caused by handling objects or routine chores. Their pattern and placement suggest an event involving interpersonal contact. Considering these factors in aggregate, pattern alignment, lack of concealment, absence of explanation, and temporal proximity builds a single coherent forensic signal. It is not definitive evidence of wrongdoing, but it is a strong contributing element to the probability model. In missing child cases, the presence of such injuries typically triggers secondary investigative steps: documentation, comparison with known behavioral patterns, cross-referencing with timeline inconsistencies, and evaluation against third-party statements. Here, the injuries interact with an existing field of contradictions already surrounding the caregiver's accounts. When the timeline is unstable, when environmental anomalies exist, and when behavioral indicators contradict typical parental distress, the injuries elevate the case from ambiguous uncertainty to focused concern. The presence of marks consistent with defensive contact is especially relevant because it integrates seamlessly with other known data points. The reported thud sound that went unchecked, the non-functioning home cameras, the inconsistent descriptions of Sebastian's behavior, and the evolving recollections across interviews. Each piece on its own could be explained away. Together, they indicate the possibility of escalating interaction, the breakdown of household stability, and a subsequent attempt to reframe the event sequence. The injuries become the physical anchor of a hypothesis already supported by narrative drift and environmental evidence. From a forensic standpoint, the marks are not peripheral. They are central to understanding whether the disappearance involved accidental wandering or an internal conflict. The fact that no verifiable alternative cause has been offered, and that the visual characteristics fail to match the sole informal explanation presented by supporters leaves the injuries as unresolved evidence. In any analytical reconstruction of the night Sebastian disappeared, these injuries represent a point that cannot be excluded, minimized, or rationalized without contradicting established investigative methodologies. The environmental record from 101 Stafford provides the only uninterrupted visual documentation from the night Sebastian disappeared. In a case defined by shifting statements, incomplete timelines, and disabled in-home cameras, the footage captured by a neighbor's garage-mounted system becomes an anchor point immune to narrative alteration. Its value lies in the fact that it records behavior rather than interpretations of behavior. It establishes the presence of a vehicle where none should be, light movement where none is expected, and directional activity matching the precise location, where canine scent tracking later failed. These elements collectively form a spatial vector, the drainage ditch corridor, that must be analyzed in detail, because it provides a rare instance where environment, timing, and biological tracking converge. Reconstructing the camera's field of view is essential to understanding why these anomalies matter. The camera is positioned at an elevated angle on the garage of 101 Stafford, facing outward toward the street. Its view encompasses a straight segment of road, the adjacent frontage area, and the upper section of the drainage ditch that runs behind and between properties. The camera does not capture the Proudfoot home directly, but captures the area immediately accessible to anyone exiting the home through the side or rear. The ditch is partially visible from the camera's right side peripheral view, enough to detect light movement without fully capturing a subject. This means the camera operates as a partial surveillance node insufficient for facial identification, but fully capable of detecting behavior patterns and movement signatures. The first anomaly captured is the stationary vehicle. Its presence is already significant because it appears during a time window roughly 3 a.m. to 3:30 a.m., when residential traffic is statistically almost non-existent. A vehicle that is merely passing through does not stop in the middle of a quiet suburban roadway, face no obstruction, and then activate its lights without continuing forward. The vehicle's headlights or tail lights illuminate suddenly, suggesting manual intervention. If a driver had simply braked or turned, the timing and intensity of illumination would follow a predictable arc. Instead, the lights activate in a way consistent with someone sitting idle and either turning the ignition key, switching into accessory mode, or preparing to move. This type of brief activation is common when a person is awaiting a signal or reacting to activity outside the vehicle. In forensic vehicle analysis, a stationary car at an anomalous hour is not categorized as suspicious solely due to timing, but due to the behavioral implications the presence of a waiting pattern. Vehicles wait when they expect an interaction pickup, drop-off, communication, or surveillance. There is no documented reason for such behavior at this location. Neither the Proudfoot family nor their neighbors report visitors or services at that hour. The absence of any corroborating context for the vehicle's presence elevates the anomaly. The second set of anomalies centers on the movement of a single flashlight within the drainage ditch. The ditch is a narrow linear depression running along property boundaries. At night, it becomes a concealed access route because its depth and shadows obscure movement from street-level visibility. It is also the exact location where search dogs reportedly lost Sebastian's scent. Environmental factors such as water flow, soil composition, and vegetation can interfere with scent tracking, but scent loss is most frequently linked to transitions, either the subject entering a vehicle or traversing a surface that does not retain scent. The coincidence between the ditch's role in the footage and its role in the scent trail is statistically unlikely to be random. It positions the ditch as an area of operational significance. The flashlight movement itself exhibits characteristics inconsistent with a wandering miner. The beam travels at a stable angle, without hesitation, doubling back only after a purposeful transit. The speed of movement measured by frame analysis indicates adult stride length and consistency. The lack of erratic motion contradicts patterns commonly associated with ASD-related wandering, where movement tends to be exploratory, nonlinear, or sensory-driven. Instead, the footage suggests someone navigating a familiar or preselected route. This introduces the possibility of intentional traversal rather than spontaneous movement. The third anomaly occurs in the clip showing rapid return movement. The light source reappears and moves back along the ditch toward the camera's angle. The return happens quickly and directly, suggesting completion of a task rather than continued searching or disorientation. The round-trip motion establishes a behavioral rhythm: exit into the ditch, brief presence outside frame, and return movement. This type of cycle is associated with either reconnaissance, transport, or object placement removal. None of these tasks align with the caregiver's public accounts of the night's events, nor do they align with spontaneous nighttime wandering from a teenager without shoes, equipment, or light. The most consequential inconsistency arises when comparing this footage to the Proudfoot's statements. Chris stated that the lights in the early footage were trash trucks, echoing what he claimed law enforcement told him. Trash collection does not occur at 3 a.m. in the area, and the vehicle's lighting pattern low-position light sources, without the elevation or intensity typical of utility vehicles, contradicts the trash truck explanation. The absence of accompanying sound, mechanical rumble, or characteristic motion further disproves this identification. The reliance on a flawed explanation indicates either lack of awareness or deliberate mischaracterization. The absence of internal camera footage from the Proudfoot home further amplifies the significance of the Stafford footage. Had the home's surveillance been operational, investigators could align internal movement with external anomalies. Instead, the only operational camera in the vicinity captured not a quiet, uneventful night, but multiple instances of unaccounted activity. The contrast between the inactivity described by the caregivers and the activity documented by the neighbor's camera is a key investigative discrepancy. When a household reports no internal or external disturbances, while an adjacent camera captures a vehicle, movement, and returning light patterns, the gap between narrative and environmental data widens. Evaluating the ditch as a potential access or escape route is central to understanding the footage. The ditch provides a low-visibility corridor shielded from direct porch light exposure and camera angles. It allows someone to traverse between properties without crossing open ground. Its connection to the roadway allows transition from foot movement to vehicle movement. In missing child investigations, such corridors are categorized as vulnerable access routes, points where abduction, concealment, or transfer could occur undetected. The flashlight activity occurring exclusively in this corridor suggests that whoever was moving in the ditch understood its concealment advantages. Several models of movement could explain the ditch activity. One model is a two-person handoff. A subject leaves the house, enters the ditch, and transfers something to the person in the waiting vehicle. Another model involves reconnaissance. Someone checks the terrain for visibility, obstacles, or evidence before returning to the house or vehicle. A third model is object placement or retrieval movement into the ditch, brief interaction outside the frame, and rapid return. All three models are consistent with intentional activity. None align fully with the hypothesis that Sebastian walked into the ditch alone without shoes or guidance. The presence of the stationary vehicle amplifies the ditch's significance. If the vehicle was involved in any capacity, the ditch would serve as the most direct path between the home and the car. The correlation between vehicle presence, ditch movement, and scent cutoff forms a triangular vector of evidence. Each component points toward a coordinated sequence rather than an accidental departure. The timing reinforces this. The environmental anomalies do not occur at random intervals. They cluster within the time frame in which Sebastian would have had to leave the house if the caregiver's timeline were accurate. The cumulative effect of these observations is the establishment of a drainage ditch vector, a forensic pathway integrating environmental behavior, canine scent data, and anomalous vehicular presence. It does not identify a perpetrator, but it identifies the route most likely involved in the disappearance event. In the absence of functioning internal cameras and reliable caregiver narratives, the ditch becomes the central physical link between residence and road. The footage does not reveal the individual responsible, but it removes the possibility that the environment was undisturbed or that the child simply wandered into darkness. It stands as a fixed record of coordinated nighttime activity in a place where no such activity should have existed. The fifth analytical vector concerns the intersection of discipline patterns, CPS involvement, and ongoing custody pressure surrounding Chris Proudfoot. While physical evidence and environmental anomalies establish opportunity and behavioral inconsistencies, the motive vector emerges from the documented patterns of disciplinary escalation, prior allegations of child mistreatment, and the legal circumstances unfolding at the time of Sebastian's disappearance. Forensic investigation does not rely on motive to establish culpability, but motive becomes structurally relevant when multiple independent pressures converge on the same individual. In this case, those pressures align with the profile of a caregiver whose disciplinary history, legal vulnerability, and need for interpersonal dominance create a recognizable risk environment. The first data point in the motive vector is Chris's acknowledgement that he struck Sebastian with a belt. This admission occurred publicly, unprompted, and was later revised. In one interview, Chris stated that he had used a belt one time. Subsequent statements contradict this, either directly or by implication. Narrative adjustments surrounding physical discipline are important because they reflect the shifting nature of disclosure. Genuine single-incident admissions tend to remain consistent. Patterns of discipline that escalate or occur repeatedly often emerge through partial disclosures, denial, or contradiction. The fact that Chris initially acknowledged the belt use and later framed it differently suggests sensitivity to how that information might be interpreted in the context of a missing child. Compounding this is the existence of CPS involvement not in one location but in two separate states. CPS investigations, whether substantiated or not, serve as indicators of prior concern. They represent the presence of formal allegations regarding child safety, discipline methods, or household conditions. In a forensic risk assessment, multi-state CPS interaction indicates a historical pattern that extends beyond isolated misunderstanding. The presence of CPS oversight increases the pressure on a caregiver to appear compliant, disciplined, and controlled, especially when navigating concurrent legal challenges. It also adds a layer of potential motive, the fear of losing access, credibility, or custody due to allegations of harmful or inappropriate caregiving practices can create emotional volatility. The allegations from ex-wives further illuminate the behavioral pattern. Although allegations are not definitive proof, they establish a profile that must be considered in context. Multiple ex-partners described coercive control, verbal aggression, punitive behavior toward children, and attempts to exert authority in ways that extended beyond normal parental discipline. The allegations include claims of pressuring a partner to terminate a pregnancy, yelling at a mother immediately after childbirth, and using physical punishment against infants. In behavioral forensics, repeated allegations across partners indicate a personality structure oriented toward dominance, entitlement, and retaliatory behavior when challenged. These traits are particularly relevant when examining potential escalation events involving vulnerable children. The dynamic becomes sharper when viewed alongside the custody battle involving Chris's daughter, Faith. At the time of Sebastian's disappearance, Chris was actively attempting to secure custody or at least improve his custodial position. Custody cases involve scrutiny of parental conduct, history of discipline, and the credibility of allegations against the caregiver. A CPS report involving Sebastian, if verified, would have weakened Chris's standing significantly. Courts heavily weigh documented disciplinary incidents, especially those involving physical punishment of minors. When a caregiver faces the possibility that recent or ongoing investigations might impact a custody outcome, Forensic analysis identifies this as a pressure vector. Pressure does not create wrongdoing, but it increases the probability of escalated responses when conflicts arise inside the home. The combination of CPS involvement and pending custody decisions creates a scenario in which maintaining control becomes psychologically and legally critical for the caregiver. For individuals with coercive control tendencies, the threat of external intervention can provoke defensive overreaction. The narrative inconsistencies across interviews suggest that Chris may have been attempting to manage not only public perception, but also the legal consequences of prior behavior. Shifts in how discipline was described, minimized, or contradicted indicate sensitivity to how these details might affect the custody case. This introduces the possibility that discipline inside the home escalated under stress, creating a chain of events that became unmanageable. When analyzing missing child cases, investigators often consider the discipline escalation model. This model describes situations in which a caregiver's attempt to punish a child escalates beyond the intended degree, resulting in injury or incapacitation. When disciplinary incidents escalate unexpectedly, the adult may respond with panic, concealment attempts, or narrative reconstruction. The presence of unexplained injuries on the caregiver, shifting timelines, and inconsistent emotional accounts all align with patterns observed in such cases. While this model cannot be confirmed, the convergence of discipline history and unexplained environmental anomalies strengthens its forensic plausibility. The allegations from ex-wives contribute an important dimension to this model. Reports of controlling behavior and punitive reactions toward children indicate that conflict escalation within the household was not an isolated risk. Behavioral consistency across relationships increases the likelihood that similar patterns persisted in the current household. It also establishes a historical tendency to respond aggressively to perceived disobedience or emotional stress. When viewed alongside the belt incident and its inconsistent reporting, this pattern suggests that punitive behavior toward Sebastian may have been more frequent or more severe than publicly acknowledged. Custody pressure adds an additional torque point to the motive vector. If a CPS report or allegation involving Sebastian were substantiated, it could jeopardize Chris's ability to gain custody of Faith. A caregiver with a strong need for control may interpret external scrutiny as a direct threat to self-image, legal standing, and authority. In such circumstances, conflict with a child, especially a child with autism, who may struggle with compliance under stress, can become a triggering point. The caregiver may react disproportionately, especially if the disciplinary event occurs after a buildup of legal frustration. Behavioral forensics identifies this as a motive under pressure, a scenario in which external stressors heighten the risk of internal escalation. The pattern of coercive control described by former partners also contextualizes the Proudfoot's behavior after the disappearance. Leaving town, avoiding communication with the biological father, and presenting shifting narratives in interviews align with the profile of someone attempting to control the narrative environment. Individuals with coercive tendencies often struggle to maintain consistent accounts under pressure because their focus is on managing perception, not on presenting factual continuity. This aligns with the inconsistencies already documented in what I said earlier. The motive vector does not claim intentional harm, but it identifies a constellation of risk factors: historical allegations, recent discipline, CPS involvement, legal pressure, and personality traits oriented toward dominance. Each of these factors can remain benign independently, but when layered, they produce a high-risk environment for conflict escalation. In forensic risk modeling, a caregiver facing legal scrutiny, emotional stress, and an imminent custody evaluation is more likely to overreact during a household confrontation, especially when discipline is already part of the relational dynamic. Linking the CPS timeline with the custody battle clarifies the broader context. The possibility of a negative CPS finding would directly impact the custody case. For a caregiver whose self-identity is tied to control and authority, the threat of losing a legal battle may escalate internal stress to a breaking point. If Sebastian resisted discipline, exhibited frustration, or acted out due to ASD-related sensory overload, the potential for conflict increases. This combination of internal and external pressures establishes the structural conditions for an event that could escalate rapidly and unpredictably. In a case where environmental anomalies, physical injuries, and narrative inconsistencies already exist, the motive vector provides a lens through which these details gain coherence. It explains why discipline incidents might be minimized, why CPS involvement is downplayed, and why custody pressure aligns temporally with the disappearance. It transforms isolated data points into an interconnected framework that must be considered in any comprehensive analysis. The sixth analytical vector examines the behavioral aftermath of Sebastian's disappearance, focusing not on what the caregivers said during interviews, but on what they did in the days and weeks that followed. In forensic psychology, post-incident behavior is one of the strongest predictors of involvement or knowledge of event. Actions taken immediately after a critical incident are rarely spontaneous. They reflect internal cognitive states, perceived risk, and the individual's understanding of what has actually occurred. When these actions diverge from known patterns of innocent caregivers, the divergence becomes an evidentiary signal. In this case, the Proudfoot's behavior leaving the home in an RV, discontinuing communication with the biological father, and presenting a noticeably detached affect contrast sharply with the expected profile of search-oriented parental behavior and raises significant investigative questions. The first behavioral anomaly is the decision to leave the residence in the weeks following the disappearance. In missing child cases, the family home is not merely a living space. It becomes the operational center for searches, notifications, interviews, follow-up visits, and potential return. Innocent caregivers overwhelmingly remain near the point where the child was last seen. This behavior is consistent across cultural, socioeconomic, and geographical lines. Parents typically refuse to leave the area, fearing that the child might return or that law enforcement may need immediate access to the home. The Proudfoot's choice to travel in an RV, effectively removing themselves from the home base, runs in direct opposition to this pattern. From a behavioral forensic standpoint, leaving the area during an active missing child investigation can indicate avoidance, fear of re-engagement with investigators, or an effort to distance oneself from the event scene. Regardless of motive, the departure creates a behavioral inconsistency that must be addressed. The second behavioral indicator is the breakdown of communication with Sebastian's father, Seth. Chris publicly stated in an interview that he and Seth communicate every day, implying a cooperative and transparent relationship. However, Seth has stated that weeks passed without any contact from the Proudfoots. This discrepancy aligns with broader patterns of narrative drift documented earlier. In forensic evaluation, cutting off communication with a non-involved parent is often interpreted as a distancing mechanism. It can reflect discomfort with the father's ongoing search efforts or a desire to avoid questions that might expose inconsistencies. Communication gaps of this magnitude, especially in the context of a missing child, suggest relational withdrawal rather than collaborative engagement. The third behavioral data point concerns Katie's reaction and her choices following the disappearance. Maternal distress patterns are well studied and highly consistent across missing child cases. Mothers typically demonstrate persistent proximity to the home, heightened vigilance, ongoing media engagement, and sustained contact with investigators. The decision to leave the area and accompany Chris instead of remaining at home to await possible updates diverges sharply from these patterns. Additionally, Katie has been described by observers as subdued, passive, or deferential during interviews, behavior that does not align with typical maternal distress profiles, particularly in acute phases of a disappearance. While individual differences exist, the contrast between expected and observed behavior is significant enough to draw investigative attention. In forensic risk modeling, step-parents occupy a statistically elevated category in child harm cases. This does not imply guilt, but it requires investigators to apply additional scrutiny to the step-parents' behavior, especially when their actions deviate from innocence-based norms. Step-parents are overrepresented in fatality datasets due to complex relational dynamics, differing levels of emotional attachment, and increased potential for conflict escalation. When a step-parent is the last known adult with the child, presents unexplained injuries, and demonstrates evasive post-incident behavior, the statistical risk profile becomes materially relevant. The behavioral choices of Chris leaving town, avoiding communication, presenting inconsistent narratives align more closely with risk indicators than with the patterns seen in innocent step-parents during active searches. Contrasting the Proudfoot's behavior with Seth's provides further clarity. Seth has remained engaged, vocal, and physically present. He has participated in searches, spoken publicly about his son, and maintained consistent contact with the community and online platforms. His distress is observable and aligned with normative patterns of parental grief and urgency. There is no inconsistency in his statements about his whereabouts, actions, or emotional state. Forensic psychology emphasizes that in missing child cases, comparisons between the involved and non-involved caregivers often reveal behavioral asymmetries. The asymmetry here is pronounced. Seth displays openness, persistence, and cooperation. The Proudfoots display withdrawal, inconsistency, and physical absence from the search area. The decision to leave the home environment carries additional forensic implications. Removing oneself from the scene disrupts law enforcement's ability to observe natural behavior, reenact potential scenarios, or access the home without logistics complications. Innocent caregivers typically remain available for spontaneous interviews or follow-up clarifications. When caregivers relocate, especially within weeks of a disappearance, it often signals a desire to reduce exposure. Forensic psychology identifies this as a potential evasion behavior, which increases in frequency when the caregiver either anticipates further scrutiny or wants to reassert control over their narrative away from the community and investigators. Another critical element is the Proudfoot's effective presentation during interviews. Behavioral analysts examine eye movement, speech patterns, emotional tone, cooperation level, and narrative coherence to identify signs of omission or narrative construction. Observers have noted that Chris frequently intercepts questions, corrects narratives, and attempts to direct the flow of the interview. This controlling posture contrasts with expected emotional dysregulation seen in innocent caregivers. Meanwhile, Katie's subdued effect, lack of spontaneous recall, and minimal elaboration on key points create a behavioral incongruity. Her presence does not reflect the outward vigilance or urgency typically exhibited by mothers in similar cases. This behavioral contrast becomes even sharper when examining the Proudfoot's level of engagement with active search operations. Innocent caregivers almost always participate physically in searches or remain in a state of readiness for involvement. Their absence from search areas, combined with the RV relocation, suggests detachment. Detachment in this context is not emotionally neutral. It reflects a behavioral withdrawal inconsistent with innocence-based profiles. While detachment alone is not an indicator of wrongdoing, its alignment with other anomalies, unexplained injuries, inconsistent timelines, and environmental irregularities adds weight to the overall forensic model. From an investigative standpoint, post-incident behavior carries significant diagnostic power. It reflects a caregiver's internal model of what happened. Innocent caregivers behave as if the child might return at any moment. Guilty or informed caregivers behave as if the child cannot return. Remaining near the home is consistent with uncertainty about the child's fate. Leaving the area suggests confidence that the child will not return or cannot be found in the immediate environment. This distinction forms the basis of behavioral inference in major investigations. When evaluating the Proudfoot's actions, the concept of behavioral alignment becomes relevant. Behavioral alignment refers to the consistency between a caregiver's outward behavior and the scenario they claim to believe. If the Proudfoots believed Sebastian had wandered off, their behavior should have aligned with prolonged search efforts, continued presence in the area, and ongoing public engagement. Instead, their behavior aligns with withdrawal, disengagement, and narrative management. This misalignment serves as an investigative signal. Even if the decision to leave town was framed as returning to work, the timing undermines the explanation. The disappearance of a child supersedes routine employment schedules for virtually all innocent caregivers. In documented cases, parents have postponed careers indefinitely while searches continue. The timing of the Proudfoot's departure raises the question of why returning to work took priority over remaining accessible to the investigation. Taken together, the Proudfoot's post-incident behavior offers a consistent pattern: physical withdrawal, communicative disengagement, affective incongruity, and deviation from established parental search behaviors. These indicators do not prove direct involvement, but they materially elevate the probability that the caregiver's understanding of the event differs from the narrative presented publicly. In forensic psychology, behavior following a critical incident is viewed as an unfiltered reflection of internal cognition. Here, that reflection signals evasion rather than innocence. The physical structure of the Proudfoot home, when analyzed through a forensic lens, introduces a series of contradictions that undermine the narrative that Sebastian left the house silently and voluntarily during the night. The internal layout, the sensory environment, the documented absence of scent, and the reported failure of home surveillance collectively create a spatial problem. The house does not behave the way it would need to behave for the wandering scenario to be true. Instead, the architectural configuration and the environmental data align more closely with a scenario in which the child did not self-exit, but either became incapacitated inside the home or was moved through a pathway that avoided detection. The forensic question is not merely whether Sebastian could have left, but whether the house provides any plausible mechanism for him to do so without producing detectable signals. The master bedroom is located directly across from Sebastian's room, separated by a short hallway that intersects with the kitchen and living areas. This arrangement creates a natural acoustic corridor. Sound produced in one room travels through open space into the opposite room. Doors, floors, and open-air paths in such configurations typically transmit noise from movement, particularly barefoot walking, door manipulation, or object handling. For Sebastian to exit without detection, a series of unlikely conditions would have to align. He would need to open his door without making noise, traverse the hallway without floor creaks, pass the kitchen without interacting with any objects, and unlock or open an exterior door without alerting anyone in the adjacent rooms. In forensic staging analysis, such sequences are considered low probability unless countermeasures are employed, which were not reported. Katie stated that she walked through the kitchen area around the time Sebastian was assumed to be heading to bed. If Sebastian were awake, moving, or preparing to exit, it is improbable that she would detect nothing: not sound, not movement, not door activity. Kitchens produce characteristic acoustic signatures: refrigerator hum, variable lighting conditions, reflective surfaces that amplify sound. These environmental elements make unnoticed nighttime movement less likely. The narrative relies on Katie being near a transition point between rooms, while Sebastian allegedly navigated through the same space undetected, yet no evidence exists that she perceived any footsteps, door sounds, or sensory cues. The absence of shoes presents another forensic inconsistency. ASD teens rarely voluntarily walk outside barefoot at night, particularly in environments containing gravel, uneven terrain, or potential sensory overload. Sensory aversion is a defining trait for many individuals on the spectrum. Cold surfaces, sharp textures, and unpredictable outdoor stimuli typically deter barefoot movement. For Sebastian to not only exit barefoot, but continue walking into a drainage ditch contradicts the behavioral evidence established by ASD specialists. Additionally, walking without shoes in such terrain would likely leave physical marks or scent traces. The lack of both intensifies the improbability of voluntary movement. Another essential element is the absence of a flashlight. Nighttime self-exit requires a visual aid in most wandering scenarios unless the individual is motivated by panic or escapism. Yet there is no indication that Sebastian retrieved a flashlight, and no flashlight is missing from the home. Voluntary wandering at night, without shoes or illumination, through a terrain characterized by ditch depth and uneven ground, is inconsistent with ASD wandering profiles. The scenario assumes that Sebastian chose the most physically uncomfortable and least navigable route without any adaptation or preparatory behavior. The no-scent problem further challenges the wandering hypothesis. Canine teams trained in scent detection rely on particles left behind by skin, breath, and movement. Even in adverse environmental conditions, scent trails do not vanish immediately. They degrade gradually. For a scent trail to terminate abruptly near the drainage ditch, one of several conditions must occur. The subject enters a vehicle, traverses a surface that obstructs scent transfer, or is carried. None of these are compatible with the theory of independent movement. If Sebastian had walked from his room, across the house, down the steps, and through the yard to the ditch, canines would have detected a continuous trail. The absence of such a trail suggests a break in physical contact with the ground, which contradicts the idea that he left the house on his own. Additionally, no scent was detected inside the house in patterns consistent with nighttime wandering. Entryways, hallways, and floors typically hold residual scent even hours after movement occurs. The lack of indoor scent disrupts the assumption that Sebastian walked from his room to any exit. This absence does not merely weaken the wandering theory, it actively conflicts with it. Scent data is one of the most reliable indicators of movement, especially when the subject is barefoot and leaving behind ample biological particles. A separate but related anomaly involves the home's interior surveillance system. According to the caregivers, the cameras were not functioning on the night in question. This collapse of visibility, internal cameras offline, while external environmental anomalies occurred, creates an imbalance in the evidentiary record. In forensic household analysis, non-functional surveillance systems during a critical event are rarely considered coincidental unless corroborating mechanical failure is verified. The absence of footage eliminates a layer of confirmability that would otherwise document nighttime movement, door openings, and transitions between rooms. Without this verification, the only environmental data available, and the only record of external movement, comes from a neighboring property. The situation places disproportionate weight on the Stafford footage and raises questions about why the internal cameras were unavailable precisely when the wandering theory requires them most. Camera blind spots further complicate the narrative. The reported blind spot overlaps with the drainage ditch, connecting the rear of the property to the roadway. This geometric overlap becomes significant when mapping the potential road of movement. If the blind spot conceals the only plausible exit path that avoids detection, its presence becomes relevant to any scenario involving external movement facilitated by another individual. In forensic modeling, blind spots are analyzed not for what they show, but for what they obscure. In this case, the obscured corridor aligns with the location where scent terminates and where flashlight activity occurred. This triangulation of scent data, blind spot location, and external activity creates a coherent spatial vector incompatible with the voluntary exit hypothesis. When these conditions are combined, the acoustic pathway through the house, the sensory realities of barefoot ASD movement, the absence of scent, the non-functional cameras, and the spatial alignment of the blind spot with the ditch, the probability of Sebastian leaving the house undetected becomes extremely low. The house does not support the mechanics required for voluntary departure. Instead, the evidence suggests that if movement occurred, it was either facilitated, concealed, or occurred under circumstances incompatible with independent action. The forensic significance of these inconsistencies becomes even clearer when compared with known patterns from accidental wandering cases. In such cases, children leave behind detectable scent, external doors register sound or movement, caregivers awaken or notice environmental changes, and internal pathways show signs of disrupted objects or noise. None of these conditions appear in the Proudfoot narrative. Instead, the situation aligns more closely with scenarios involving internal incapacitation followed by movement through a concealed route. Such models do not accuse. They simply preserve compatibility between data points that the wandering model fails to integrate. In summary, the layout of the house, the sensory and behavioral expectations of an ASD teenager, the no-scent anomaly, and the location of the camera blind spot collectively undermine the plausibility of silent voluntary exit. The physical environment does not align with the narrative provided. Rather, it aligns with the possibility of an escalation event inside the home followed by movement through the blind spot corridor and into the ditch, an alternative scenario that fits the environmental and biological data more completely than the assumption The final analytical layer is not constructed from any single anomaly, but from the intersection of multiple independent vectors. Each vector, physical, behavioral, environmental, procedural, and statistical, has evidentiary value on its own. Yet the power of forensic reasoning lies in examining how these vectors interact and whether they converge toward or away from particular individuals. In the disappearance of Sebastian, the injuries visible on the caregiver's arm, the shifting and contradictory timeline accounts, the environmental anomalies captured externally, the history of CPS involvement coupled with active custody pressure, the departure from expected post-incident behavior, the internal narrative inconsistencies, the movement signatures in the drainage ditch, and the statistically elevated risk associated with step-parent dynamics in ASD caregiving environments all align in a single direction. This directional alignment does not convict, it quantifies probability, and the probability does not orient toward stranger involvement, wandering, or random environmental fate. It orients toward the one individual who sits at the center of every vector, the stepfather. The injury vector forms the first point on this convergence map. Unexplained marks, especially those resembling defensive contact, represent physical anomalies that require reconciliation with the timeline. No benign explanation has been offered. When injury appears on a caregiver at a moment of disappearance, forensic protocols categorize it as a risk indicator demanding contextual accounting. The absence of such accounting is not a conclusion, but a gap, one that grows more significant as other vectors begin pointing in the same direction. The second vector involves the timeline contradictions. 17 shifts across multiple interviews, ranging from minor phrasing inconsistencies to major reassignments of time, action, and emotional response, undermine the stability of the narrative. Memory does not shift structurally without motive. Innocent inaccuracies tend to preserve core chronology even when detail changes. In the Proudfoot narrative, the core chronology changes repeatedly. Each shift is explainable in isolation. Together, they form a pattern of narrative construction rather than recall. Forensic pattern analysis gives weight to repeated adjustments when they consistently orient toward exoneration rather than revelation. Environmental anomalies form the third vector. The stationary vehicle, the rapid flashlight movement through the ditch, and the alignment of that movement with the scent cutoff point create a spatial model incompatible with voluntary exit. These external data points exist independently of caregiver statements. They corroborate none of the stated possibilities offered by the family. Instead, they map onto a potential movement corridor that bypasses household visibility and aligns geographically with known investigative failure points. When environmental data contradict stated household events, the data, not the statements, take precedence. The CPS and custody pressure vector adds psychological and situational context. Pressure does not prove action, but it increases motive potential. The risk of losing custody of another child, combined with a history of CPS investigations in 2 states, creates a setting in which disciplinary escalation or frustration becomes more probable. The allegations from ex-wives regarding coercive control and physical maltreatment further contextualize the environment. While each allegation is unverified on its own, their recurrence across relationships creates a consistent behavioral pattern. Such patterns do not identify intent, but identify risk, a critical distinction in forensic modeling. Behavioral evasion forms the next vector. Departure from the home soon after the disappearance, the breakdown in communication with the biological father, and the subdued effect of Katie, compared with expected maternal distress, fall outside the behavioral norms observed in similar cases. Innocent caregivers demonstrate heightened vigilance, remain in proximity, and maintain open channels with all parties involved. The Proudfoot's behavior deviates from these expectations in ways that suggest management of exposure rather than search-oriented engagement. This behavioral divergence gains weight when viewed alongside earlier vectors. Story shifting, observed in both Chris and Katie's accounts, adds another structural layer. Revisions of key details, activities, timelines, emotional states. Search efforts occur not as clarifications but as transformations. This pattern of revision is commonly associated with attempts to reconcile public criticism, repair logical gaps, or align narrative elements with external information that emerges later. Forensic linguistics identifies such alterations as indicators of narrative construction, rather than spontaneous recollection. The mystery vehicle and ditch movement vector strengthens the convergence map by introducing directional evidence. If the ditch represents the only feasible route that bypasses indoor visibility, and the vehicle represents a potential transport or communication point, then the combination becomes a coherent pathway. The likelihood of an ASD teen independently selecting this road at night, barefoot, without light, and leaving no scent trail remains extremely low. The likelihood of an adult using that route to avoid detection is substantially higher. Katie's emotional profile introduces the non-maternal distress vector. The subdued affect, lack of outward urgency, and willingness to leave the home during an active search contradict established maternal distress patterns. While emotional expression varies across individuals, deviations of this magnitude, especially when coupled with narrative inconsistencies, create additional markers for forensic attention. Maternal detachment does not imply involvement, but it reduces the probability that the stated beliefs align with internal understanding of the event. The final vector is statistical. Stepfathers are historically overrepresented in child injury and fatality datasets, particularly when the child has increased care needs due to developmental or behavioral conditions. This does not define guilt, it defines probability space. When investigators evaluate risk in the absence of direct evidence, statistical models supplement pattern recognition. In cases involving unexplained injuries, inconsistent narratives, and behavioral anomalies, the step-parent risk profile becomes a relevant comparison point. When all vectors are combined, a forensic convergence map emerges. The injuries point inward. The timeline shifts point inward. The environmental anomalies point inward. The CPS history and custody pressure point inward. The behavior after the disappearance points inward. The inconsistencies in narrative and emotion point inward. The ditch movement and scent cutoff point inward. None of these vectors individually establish what occurred. Together, they form a directional map that aligns with caregiver-involved event models seen in prior investigations. What they do not align with are the wandering model, which requires continuous scent, self-directed barefoot movement, and coherent indoor to outdoor transition, or the stranger abduction model, which requires forced entry, external noise, or observed third-party interaction. The convergence map does not guarantee a conclusion, but it narrows the field of plausibility to a degree that cannot be ignored. The core investigative question becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. If every independent arrow in the dataset points toward the same individual, why has the public investigative posture not shifted accordingly? This question is not an accusation but a structural observation. When physical, environmental, behavioral, and statistical indicators converge so tightly, standard forensic logic suggests deeper examination of the individual occupying the center of the pattern. As the case progresses, community engagement remains essential. If viewers possess information whether about the environment, past behavior, household dynamics, or unreported sightings, they can provide context that formal investigations may not yet have incorporated. In cases shaped by silence, missing data, and narrative conflict, community-sourced intelligence becomes a critical corrective force. Anyone with first-hand knowledge, even fragments, should step forward. The convergence map shows a direction. Community insight may help clarify what the map has not yet fully revealed.